eSource for clinical research. So is everybody on the same page as far as what is eSource? Because I'm going to get into different types of eSource. Okay, but for purposes of the conversation, for eSource means electronic source data, right? Okay. So a little bit more about me. Like I said, I'm from FHIR. I work on the IT side of the house in R&D business technology. I'm in a group called New Clinical Paradigm, and it's the remit of our group to scan a very broad landscape across industries to identify new and emerging technologies that we can apply at FHIR, particularly in clinical research and clinical development. We work in a variety of different areas. We are working on blockchain, working on mobile devices and apps, working on data donation, but we're also working on eSource, which I am the technology co-lead for. Here today, though, representing Transcelerate. So how many people have heard of Transcelerate? Okay, a few. Okay, that's okay, because I'm going to get into, for those of you who haven't heard of Transcelerate, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Transcelerate's an industry consortium of 19 pharmaceutical companies, and I am working on an eSource team, particularly a technology and standards working group. So I'm co-leading that group. Okay, but I'm going to admit something to everybody. I am probably the least technical person at this event. I am not a developer. I do not write code. I'm not a solution architect. My background is actually more in project management and business analysis. So a little bit different than what some of you guys and most of those guys out there do. But I am leading some technology working groups, and I'm trying to bring the perspectives of the pharma industry to the FHIR development community. Okay, so before I get going, just my disclaimer, I have to get the legal piece out of the way. The views and opinions that I'm sharing with you today and that are in these slides are mine and mine alone. They don't necessarily represent FHIR or HL7 or any affiliates. So just so we got that out of the way, legal makes me do that when I go out and talk. So what is Transcelerate? So like I said, Transcelerate's an industry consortium of biopharma companies. It's a nonprofit. So all these companies come together with a shared vision to improve the health of people around the world and to simplify and accelerate clinical research. So really it's the R&D piece and bring innovative new therapies to patients. So that's why we all come together. Simply put, though, we need to gain efficiencies in how we do our business, so how we execute clinical development. Okay, we have a very broad global reach. As you can see, these are the 19 companies that are part of Transcelerate, so we kind of span the globe. I think a majority of these companies have a presence quite multinationally. We have right now over 1,000 people from our member companies working on a variety of initiatives within Transcelerate. Transcelerate started in 2012. Initially it was 10 member companies. It's grown pretty quickly, really. In the last 6 years, we've nearly doubled. So we're up to 19 members now, Novartis being the last one to join last year, I believe. We've also spun off a subsidiary called BioCelerate. The remit of that group is to work on preclinical research. And as I mentioned, we have a number of initiatives going on, so over 25 initiatives right now. What I love about working with the Transcelerate group is this culture of collaboration that we have. I don't think it was that many years ago that you would have been able to get a number of people from different pharmaceutical companies in a room together and have them work jointly on projects. It just didn't happen. People kept things very close to the vest. But what I think has happened over the last quite a few years, I guess, is that thinking has evolved, and we're starting to realize it's the science that makes us competitive, not some of the things that enable the science. So some of the stuff that we're doing here with FHIR, with some of our other initiatives and beyond eSource, that's really where we need to come together and share ideas because we all benefit from that, but in particular our patients, because patients are waiting for new treatments. Within the work that we're doing across these initiatives, it's very broad, very deep. It really spans, I guess, 3 different strategic areas. So we are working to overcome some of the inefficiencies of clinical drug development, which for those of you who aren't familiar, Rick talked about that a little bit earlier today. It takes a long time to bring drugs to market. A number of trials have to be run, a number of regular approvals are needed, but before you even get to clinical development, you have that preclinical research. That takes a lot of time too, because there are thousands and thousands of different compounds that scientists are working on, and maybe only a few of them actually get moved up into development where you're going to actually run a trial. So it takes a long time. I think the last thing I saw was 12 to 14 years to bring a drug to market. So it can cost upwards of billions of dollars to get there. So part of the work that we're doing with TransCelerate is trying to overcome some of the inefficiencies in that process to kind of speed things up, get the drugs out faster, help patients in need. So the strategic initiatives, the alignment of, I guess, strategy across the different initiatives really fall into 3 buckets. So I'll start over on the right. So the first one being patient and site experience. So all the initiatives that are listed there, and I can't speak to every one, I'm not working in those, but all those initiatives that are listed there are really focused on improving the patient experience first and foremost, but also the experience from the people that run our clinical trials at our study sites, so investigators, study coordinators, some of those folks. Next at the bottom is drug safety. So all of those initiatives working towards enhancing the efficiencies around drug safety. And then finally, harmonizing processes and sharing information, which that one is where eSource falls. So that's the group that I'm working in. And if you want more information on some of these initiatives, I'm happy to share the TransCelerate website. There's information about each one of these initiatives there. It's TransCelerate BioPharmaInc.com. Okay, so keep talking about this eSource team and eSource. So what exactly is the vision of the TransCelerate eSource team? So really, we're trying to help drive the industry towards adopting the use of electronic source data to improve global clinical science and global execution of clinical trials. So how are we doing that? Well, I'll tell you first, I'll go to the bottom and tell you what we're not. So what we're not doing is we're not developing electronic tools. We're not creating or developing standards. We're not developing eSource technologies. One of the challenges that we have is we run into some antitrust issues if pharma consortia comes together and says this is what everybody has to do. So we can't do that, but what we can do is we can execute on some of these things that are listed here. So we've done a scan of the landscape around sponsors and technology, and we've published a couple of white papers. I'm happy to share those links as well on the landscape assessment from a sponsor perspective and technology perspective to enable eSource for clinical research. We're just finished a white paper that's not yet published. It's in review, hopefully it's coming out soon to talk about eSource capabilities, again, from sponsor perspective. Some of the challenges and some of the solutions that we see, some of the, I guess, how we tackle some of those challenges. So that'll be coming out hopefully early next year. We've got some other papers coming up, logical architecture for eSource solutions, again, just something that we suggest as a potential architecture for sponsor companies, meaning pharmaceutical companies, to implement eSource solutions. We've worked quite a bit with demonstration projects, primarily HL7 FHIR Connectathons, at which we submit use cases for vendors to come and work on clinical research. So that's all really related to clinical study data collection. But in addition, we haven't forgot people and process, because I think technology is ahead of people and process, particularly when you talk about pharma. It's very challenging to move the needle, but we are addressing change management approaches as well as stakeholder engagement. So we have a working group that's focused on some of that people and process piece as well. And then finally, we're also trying to develop metrics and some KPIs. So how do we measure success when all is said and done and we get these eSource solutions in place, or we do some of the work that we're doing at TransCelerate to get us to where we have eSource solutions? What does success look like? We had some initial, metrics that we came out with, but sponsor companies responded to some of those, and I think we didn't do a good enough job of defining what eSource is, because depending on who at the sponsor company was reading that survey, eSource meant something different. So for me, it might have meant EHRs. For another sponsor, it might have been mobile devices. So we had to be a little more clear to get our metrics right. So we're tweaking that. So we will be coming out with some metrics here shortly. Okay, and also just one other thing on the metrics. Really what that's for is really for sponsors to measure, what kind of savings, for example, would you have if you have an eSource solution in place with source data verification, for example. If we have electronic solutions in place and we can electronically source that data, then the thought is we should be able to reduce monitoring, for example, which has a lot of cost associated with it. So that's just some of those efficiencies and cost savings that we're looking for. Okay, so the eSource initiative at TransCelerate, really we've identified an unmet need. Despite the fact that we've had some regulatory guidance recently, most recently FDA in July, but FDA also put out another guidance prior to that in the US. Adoption in industry is still pretty low, and that's really due to a lack of standards, interoperability, and regulatory guidance. And so not to contradict myself, so we have some guidance from FDA, but what I mean by regulatory guidance as being an unmet need is I'm thinking more globally. So we've had some of that guidance in the US from the FDA, but from a global perspective, it's not quite there yet. I was recently on a trip to Asia, and regulatory guidance we haven't had anything published yet. We haven't had any guidance from PDMA, for example, or CMDA. So other countries there's still trying to figure out what agency is actually going to be providing any guidance. So there's still a lot of uncertainty around regulatory. The interoperability piece, we have challenges there, which we think that FHIR is a great enabler to help solve for, but we have challenges with interoperability because every site is different, every sponsor's systems are different, so solutions that we try to come up with aren't probably going to be one size fits all. But again, that's where FHIR becomes so attractive for us. And then lack of standards, that again goes back to the differences between not only how sites are set up, how sponsors' systems are set up, but when you're sharing that data, sponsors collect data in CDISC standards versus however the site's collecting data. Maybe it could be across the board because, again, every site is different. Again, having FHIR as an enabler can kind of solve for some of those issues for us as well. So really, like I said, our objective is to facilitate the adoption of eSource solutions across industry, optimize electronic data sources wherever we can, because we're thinking that is really goes back to the vision of TransCelerate to start creating these efficiencies in clinical development. Okay, and ultimately, it benefits everybody. It benefits sponsors, it benefits our sites, but more importantly, it benefits our patients. Okay, so we're doing all this great stuff, and eventually we hope to get to where we have these eSource solutions in place, but what does success look like? So this first one is hard to read, but it's system interoperability and seamless system integration. So that's obviously a given. That's success to us. Getting to where we have this harmonized clinical data collection process and standards in place that enable data exchange, again, that's where you see FHIR showing up. That's success. So that's something we want to be able to check the box on. The regulatory piece I spoke about, having those clear expectations and guidance from regulatory bodies across the globe would certainly help us out. And then the patient centricity, I spoke about patients, just improve patient engagement. And I'll get to why some of that's important and how this fits in there in a minute. And then real-time access to data. So being able to get to data quicker means quicker decision making. So our clinicians can decide to either kill a trial because they have access to that data sooner so they can make decisions about not moving forward, or on the opposite, they can make decisions about accelerating if they're seeing the results they want to see. So really having access to real-time data and clean data is key there. So those are some of our, I guess, visions of success, but that's really a perfect world. And we know we're not close to that. Hopefully before I retire, we'll see some of this stuff come to fruition. But really, we still have a lot of challenges. eSource has the potential to be something great, But why hasn't it been readily adopted? I hit on some of this earlier. The lack of system interoperability. Again, that's a technology barrier. But really, the other three are more around people and process. And so it's really important, even as we work through some of the technology challenges, we work with some of the development community on FHIR standards. We still can't forget the people and process. Historically, pharma is very slow to change, and that's really in part because it's so highly regulated. So that's why having that guidance from regulators is very important, very critical for us. And then just internal, and also our internal stakeholders, that and at the sites too. They're not going to spend money to run trials if eSource, I'll say eSource enabled trials, if the regulators aren't going to accept the data. So that's really kind of what that last one is about. Okay, so it really, again, technology, we know there's some challenges there, but ultimately, people and process go right there with it, kind of hand in hand. Okay, so I've been speaking about eSource, but just to be clear on what Transcelerate defines as eSource, we've said there's 4 types of eSource for clinical research anyway. And again, there's some overlap maybe in each one of these. The first one is non-case report form data. So not sure how many people are familiar with running a clinical trial, but essentially today, we have case report forms, which I'll talk about in a second, and we have non-case report form data. So the non-case report form data is essentially like labs, ECGs, data that could come from, let's say, wearables or something. So it's really data that doesn't fit on a case report form within an electronic data capture system. Okay. Then we have direct data capture. Direct data capture would be someone at a site that doesn't have source document, but is entering data directly to an EDC, directly through like an iPad, a mobile device. Okay, so that's just a direct data capture. There is no source data. That is the source. Devices and apps, kind of self-explanatory. Wearable devices, mobile apps. It could be eConsent. It could be ePro. Really any electronic device, but also thinking of devices that perhaps a caregiver could be using to report out, patient-reported outcomes. So it could really be any device and apps that's not really being collected by someone at a site. It's really being collected from patients. Okay, and then there's the electronic health record data, which that's where our focus has been, primarily with our eSource Transcelerate team. Okay, so that's what I want to hit on a little bit next. Okay, so what have we been doing at Transcelerate? So I gave a little background, I gave kind of here's what eSource is, but what have we been doing? So I joined this group, I guess just over a year ago in September of 2017. And at the time, and still today, teams working on demonstration projects and standards. So really trying to leverage what's out there in the healthcare industry, partner with regulators, partner with vendors, partner with standards bodies to all come together to advance eSource. We've had some eSource advancement roundtables globally. We invite members like I said, members from those communities, the tech companies, the regulators, academic institutions, clinical study sites. So we try to ideate, we try to get input, we try to seek feedback. Are we doing the right things? What could we be doing better? But ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to bridge this gap between our sites and our sponsor systems. So how do we do that? Well, with technology obviously, but also we have to have the standards there. So that's that bridge between FHIR and CDISC, which is what pharmaceutical companies need that run clinical trials. So my first, I guess, indoctrination into this Transcelerate world when I started came at my first Connectathon, which was in La Jolla in September of 2017. And so I was very new to this. We submitted some use cases. I think we had 3 use cases. One was around really patient recruitment, so it was using FHIR to go and search through an EHR to find patients that met inclusion criteria for a trial. That one seemed to be pretty low-hanging fruit, not too challenging. Then we had another, I think our second one was around identifying a research subject that's part of a research study in an EHR, sourcing relevant data for that study, so data that's per clinical trial protocol, getting that data and mapping, transforming it, delivering it into an electronic data capture tool. With that one, it seems like some of the vendors that came, we only had 4 vendors that showed up to work on these, okay, so, which is fairly typical for research. But it seems like they had kind of done some stuff in advance, and they pretty much didn't have much work to do when they got there, so it really didn't, I didn't really feel like we got a lot out of it. They were able to prove that they could get some of the data that we wanted. And then we had another use case around real-world evidence. So that one was a little challenging, and all these use cases are on the HL7 FHIR wiki, Connectathon wikis, if you'd like to take a look. So 4 vendors showed up. We didn't really get what we wanted. The real-world data piece didn't really work out so well. We decided to kind of go back to the drawing board. We cleaned up our use cases, and then we went to New Orleans in January. So next Connectathon, we were pretty excited about. We got there, and we had 1 vendor and 1 academic institution that showed up to help us on clinical research. So it really, I guess the good and the bad. The bad was obviously we didn't have a good audience there, and really didn't accomplish much as far as coding. But what we did do is we went in a room and we just said, you know what, forget this, let's go whiteboard. So we had a site perspective. It was an academic institution. We had an EDC vendor. We had pharma, and we all just kind of sat and brainstormed. And so what we came away with was, for the next Connectathon, we really needed to do a better job of creating inputs. Okay, so in other words, for us that meant mapping FHIR to CDISC. That meant creating data models to help some developers at the Connectathon. So we had to do a better job there. I say we, but honestly, we have a great team, eSource team, with people who are very good at mapping and understand data models probably better than I do, definitely better than I do. So those guys worked on that, so I certainly am not taking credit for that. But because of that, we weren't going to meet the Cologne deadline. We just didn't feel like we had enough time to prepare. So we didn't go to Cologne, but we did go to Baltimore. And so in Baltimore, these are the use cases that we submitted. So we went back to the real world use case. We also decided to start tackling schedule of events. So the protocol schedule of activity is what it's called. That's a tough one because right now, you know, we have to map a visit to a case report form in our electronic data capture tool. So we need to know what happened on what visit. There's certain data that's supposed to be collected per our clinical trial protocol on a given visit, and so we have to find that data in the EHR. So that was a good one that we threw out there. Lab data, we had talked about lab data previously. I think we had that actually in the September Connectathon in 2017, but we kind of expanded on that. We did a complete mapping of CDISC standards to FHIR for labs. We found some gaps, which we expected, but going into the Connectathon, that one turned out to be a really good one. We found the extensions where we needed to build extensions. We worked with some different working groups from HL7, the BR&R group in particular, and there was a couple others that we worked with, but getting input from some of those other groups was very helpful. And then finally, we started tackling adverse events. Adverse events is a little bit of a challenging one as well because terminology in EHR doesn't necessarily map to write directly to some of the resources, but also for clinical research. So we had some challenges there, but we're working through that. We're working on some data models there. So there's still a lot of work left to be done with adverse events. So anyway, so we had some good success. We came away with some work that still needs to be done. And I'm happy to share those results too. I have those, I just don't have them in slides, but I can share some of that as well. So anyway, so with that said, what's next? So we're going to continue to work on some of these things. Like I said, lab data in particular, we're getting to where we hope next year we'll have an implementation guide, and we're again partnering with groups within HL7 to help us create that. And it was actually very nice when we were in Baltimore at the last Connectathon. Reen and some of the team from FHIR were there, so it was really good to connect with them because, to be perfectly honest, our TransCelerate eSource team is very naive when it comes to creating implementation guides, so they gave us some good advice to kind of help get us started. So partnering with some of the FHIR community has been really beneficial. Mapping adverse event, that's one I spoke about. We still have some challenges there, so we have reached out to patient care group as well as the BRNR group for some help. And then for clinical, we're creating clinical data model for that clinical plans, that schedule of activities. So that's some ongoing work. I'm not sure yet if we're going to submit use cases for the next Connectathon in San Antonio in January. I think we're just going to continue working through some of these. We want to get something good first and not just have fragmented pieces of use cases all over the place that aren't finished. So I want to get some of this stuff complete before we move on. Okay, and so with that said, really the reason that I was asked to come here was really to ask for help from the FHIR development community. Again, I don't have FHIR experts on my team at Pfizer. We don't have FHIR experts on the team at Transcelerator. None of us are FHIR developers. I don't know if any of our member companies, at least that are on the eSource team, have FHIR developers on their staff. I know at Pfizer we don't. So that's definitely a gap for a lot of us. So we have to reach out to this community and ask for help. We need to know, does it sound reasonable, some of the things that we're doing? Are we headed down the right track? We're trying to get some of the lower hanging fruit if we can, but we're also trying to tackle some of the more challenging ones like adverse events, for example. How can we help continue to drive this forward? How can we advance eSource? Should we continue doing what we're doing now, or do you guys have ideas that may help us? Because we really want to advance eSource, particularly as we go into next year. We want to make some more progress. And basically, it's just participation, involvement. We are seeking help from the development community to work on some of these use cases because research tends to be forgotten about a little bit, and understandably so. I mean, majority, it seems to me, majority of apps that are developed are more patient-facing or site-facing, which patients should come first. That's where it should be. But we don't want to leave research behind either, because really we want to be able to get medicines, therapies to patients sooner because the patients are waiting. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to open it up to any questions anyone might have. Guys are being way too easy on me. Yeah, Rick?
Going back to your mapping slides, can
yes.
you expand a bit on what you're mapping to? Is it always to CDISC or is it to
So
standards?
it's CDISC, because the way that we have to collect data is in the CDISC standard. And so right now, when we capture data in our EDC tool, essentially this is what happens at a site, and I know you know this. There's a study coordinator at a site, and they, let's say, take a vital sign, or they get some demography data from a patient. They enter that data into the EHR, and then they have to swivel their chair, and they have to log into a sponsor or pharmaceutical company's electronic data capture tool. And they have to say, okay, that blood pressure was 120/70, and they have to type it in. So it's basically dual data entry. Extremely inefficient, but the data that's captured in our EDC tool is in a CDISC standard. And so that's why we have to do that mapping. Now, at Pfizer, I can't speak for everybody, but we, of course, have to make things even more difficult. We have to have CDISC and Pfizer standards. So we have some legacy Pfizer standards that we also use that appear up every once in a while. But for the most part, we're all CDISC. So that's why we're doing those mappings to CDISC. Yep. Any other questions? Okay, I'm happy to talk to you about some of the stuff we did at the last Connectathon. I've got some readout. Challenge with some of the Transcelerator stuff is I can't share it publicly until it's been approved by legal to share it externally. But because it was a Connectathon, I think all of that's pretty much out there and open anyway. But I can point you to some of the stuff that we've done. Or if you have any suggestions at all how we can continue to advance eSource, please do reach out. Happy to take your suggestions back to our team. Thanks, guys.